Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock, Managing Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors. Now, if you're looking to purchase a property that's not going to auction, how do you create a strategy to put your offers in place, making sure that you're not overpaying, you're creating a strong proposal to the selling agent and to the vendor and securing it for as cheaply as possible? Well, it all requires a purchasing or offering strategy. So to walk us through a strategy, we're talking to Matt Chamberlain from Chamberlain Brown. He talks us through how to assess buyer activity and interest in the property, how to look at the motivations of the vendor and even discover them, and also the motivations of the selling agent and how you can leverage all those three components into building a strategy to purchase this property against the competition for the best possible price. It's a great interview with Matt, and I'm sure you're going to learn something from it. Here's Matt.
Matt Chamberlain, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Thanks, Mike. It's always a pleasure to have a good conversation about property with you.
Well, let's try and make it a second good conversation, and I've got no doubt that you'll hold up your side of the bargain. Today we're talking about a four-step guide to setting a negotiation strategy. Now, we're specifically talking about private treaty sales rather than auction, which we discussed previously. But you've come up with this four-step guide that's going to be helpful for, of course, the buyers agents within your team, but also the individual listeners that are looking to transact potentially on a property that's on market themselves. Run us through this system and give us a bit of a lay of the land.
Yeah, thanks, mate. I think before we get into the finer details of it, the most important part of building this framework for our buyers agents and even using it as a listener is to help you feel as prepared as possible going into what can be a negotiation on probably the biggest purchase of your life. So that's the crux of why you'd want to develop a negotiation strategy yourself or follow a process so that you don't get into a situation where you're making a bit of a rash decision, maybe an emotional decision, that can, some people, cost them, tens of thousands of dollars. So to give you a bit of a snapshot or an overview, this part of our process would be when we've walked through the property, we love what we see, we've then done our area due diligence, you've checked things like your building and pest inspection, you've had the contract reviewed, so you're in a position where you're really informed. It's now starting to talk about the dollars and cents of the deal.
Before we jump into that, Matt, if I might just as an aside ask you the question, on average, do you think that people have a negotiation strategy if they're not working with a professional, right? Because I'm guessing that the strategy is, okay, it's on the market for, say, $850. We're going to offer $820 and see what happens. And that, maybe I'm being a bit unfair, but it seems to be like that's probably where the average strategy starts and ends, would you say?
I agree 100%. That's right. And if the majority of buyers, if they did want to implement a bit of a strategy, chances are they're probably going to the real estate agent for advice, which can be that extra thorn in the backside.
Yeah. So just to be clear, let's not do that, dear listener, because as I think we've mentioned a number of times on the show, they don't work for the buyer. And yes, sometimes they like to keep a list of buyers, and they will call you and say something's popped up that it's matched your brief, as it were, but their motivation is not for you to buy the property. The motivation is to sell it because they probably have the listing that matches you. So I'd caution people to speak to a sales agent around the strategy to secure the property.
Absolutely, and it's actually part of our negotiation strategy. So we're going to cover that in a little bit.
Yeah. All right. So sorry to interrupt. You have the floor.
That's all right. Thanks, mate. So the four parts of developing a negotiation strategy. The first one is it's really important to assess other buyer activity on the property.
Yep.
Of course, we all know that if there's one purchaser looking to purchase the property, they have more leverage than if there's 2, 3, 4, or 10 purchasers.
Yep.
So it's really important to understand that. The second thing is the diving into the vendor's motivation for selling.
Yep.
And I'd imagine this probably isn't too much new news to your listeners, but we'll dive into the nuances of how to actually gather that information in a moment. And then the third thing is your real estate agent's motivations for selling the property, which kind of leads into the conversation we had earlier. And then the last thing is bringing those first three things, which are more of like your art form components of the negotiation, into the data side of a negotiation, which is your understanding of what the property is worth in a fair market.
Okay. So when you're doing an appraisal of the value, or let's say even someone at home can do a comparative market analysis, they can go, this property is a 4-bedroom in this location of this sort of standard, and these 3 properties sold within the last few months, and this one's a little bit better, this one's a little bit worse, and everyone can kind of come to a rough idea, hopefully, of where it should sit. But you're overlaying those 3 points. How hot the market is, how many other people are around, whether it seems like the owner is in a sort of a rush to sell, and whether that agent is kind of wanting to put a deal together quickly, which you can get a sense for, and that would sort of indicate where the value sits based on those factors in concert, would you say, with the comparables?
Absolutely, because the goal of asking the right questions to answer those first 3 points is to identify whether or not there's a point of information that you can leverage, which will result in a cheaper purchase price.
Yep.
So a great example, we'll go through them individually, but think about you've got a seller who has purchased a property elsewhere, and they need to sell their property to access the funds to pay for their new purchase.
Yes.
Now, that particular seller is under a time schedule.
Yeah.
And depending on that time schedule and also the other buyer activity on the property, we might be able to position a negotiation strategy and our offers to satisfy that need of a quick sale, but in our favour when it comes to the purchase price.
It begs the question, if you were the sales agent, would you tell potential purchasers that your vendor is under the duress of the time that they need to sell that property? Otherwise, they're not going to have the funds to settle on that property. I mean, that seems mad that competitive information would be given away by the person that's really supposed to be advocating for them.
It's a really good question. I think the answer to that is every real estate agent, in our experience, operates their sales strategy and their negotiations in a very slightly different way. So some real estate agents, again, coming back to the personal incentive, might know that that's a defined, decision-making time frame on their seller's part. So sharing that with purchasers might actually help them achieve the sale quicker. But again, that's a personal incentive, maybe not necessarily in the seller's best interest. So, some agents are forthcoming. Others, it's much harder to get that information. But if you ask the right questions, you're generally going to still be able to get the right answers. And that's where it turns into that art form, right?
Yes.
Every buyer probably has read an article that says, ask the seller or ask the real estate agent why the seller is selling. But our team knows that you've got to dig and dig and dig, and that might be over 3 or 4 or 5 conversations and asking indirect questions that will help the real estate agent share a bit more than they might want to.
Interesting. You're a sneaky little man, Matt Chamberlain, but we're all going to be the beneficiaries of your sneaky tactics as you share your secret herbs and spices. Starting with assessing buyer activity. So if you go to an open house and there's 100 pairs of shoes out the front, that's a fairly good indication that the property is of interest. But how else can you see that, and why is it important?
So a couple of things. If we talk about before you've spoken to the real estate agent, so just from your walking through the property, the shoes is a good example. The line of people out the front of the property, usually it's really busy at the start of an inspection and dissipates. So if you've got a line, 20, 25 minutes into the inspection time frame, that's another sign that it's there's a fair few people coming through. And then the other thing, or stepping forward to having the conversation with the real estate agent and trying to understand other buyer activity, it'd be asking questions like, how much inquiry have you had on this property?
Yep.
Real estate agents love to tell their owners how many people have walked through, and they talk in terms of groups of buyers.
Yep.
So you might have mum, dad, and the kids. That's considered one group.
Yep.
So not necessarily 4 people, but those numbers of buyers through open homes can change depending on the time of year, the type of market. So for instance, here in Newcastle in spring at the moment, real estate agents are really confident to tell you that there's probably 30, 40 people walking through open homes.
Yep.
Compared to in winter, with a few interest rate rises, a bit closer to home, they would have been lucky to get 10, 15 people through properties. So that's, go ahead.
You can see some of those analytics online as well with the listings, like the number of views to a property, or is that sort of only behind the scenes that the selling agent can see?
It's a really good question. If it's available online, it's something that we haven't been able to find ourselves. I guess in reflection of that, it's more likely or better to get that information directly from the real estate agent. Then it's a true fact. So if you think about it though, we're still talking really high level buyer interest. You can have 100 people walk through a beautiful home, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be 100 people purchasing it. It might just be that it was an iconic property and everyone wanted to have the sticky beat.
Yeah, or Daniel Johns used to live there, so everyone wants to kind of come through and pretend that they have $15 million to buy it just to get a whiff of the fame, right?
Exactly right. So the next step to understanding your buyer activity is asking the agent questions that will hopefully get you the answers on serious buyer interest. A good question is, how many contracts have you issued to prospective buyers? That's usually a step beyond the initial open home conversation that the real estate agent will send a contract. And then, if you're feeling cheeky, if you know the right way to ask it, and you have a relationship with the agent, you might be able to identify how many offers have been made, and some agents and some relationships that we have, we might actually get the exact figures.
Yeah, right. The exact figures for the offer? Correct.
Yeah.
Oh, so not just, there's 4 offers, but there's 4 offers. The first one's exit. I mean, that's, it goes to show the value of the relationships. And I guess they can always say no, right? So there's no harm in asking. And are you ever surprised by the amount of detail that you're given? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Yes. I can think of one at the moment. We've had an agent called me back yesterday with a counter offer from the seller, and he said, "Look, the seller's at 1.4. The circumstances around it, I think he can do a bit better than that, and he's actually really worried about moving out of the property after he sells it. He's been, I guess, using the property for him and his family for a period of time, and he's really worried about not just himself, but his mother and where she's going to live afterwards." Yep. So he actually suggested it to me. My thinking was going that way anyway, but knowing we're purchasing for an investor, we're going to add a few terms to our next offer. Of course, well below that 1.4 mark, but that would be really advantageous and valuable to that seller.
Yep.
that are going to help us get a better purchase price. And it actually leads on to that second point.
Now, when you say yesterday, this episode, we're not going to say when it was recorded because there could be a real estate agent that will recognize themselves in this story, but we appreciate you sharing that. When it comes to the motivation of the vendor, you've sort of touched on it there. That really indicates, I suppose, their willingness to put a deal together quickly and perhaps their appetite for selling below the advertised price, or even if we know that offers are going well over the advertised price because we're in a hot market. I mean, how would you pivot based on the advice from the landlord, from the selling agent about the motivations?
It comes down to experience in knowing what levers you can pull and how valuable they are to individuals. But I think the other part to this is probably adding a grain of salt to everything you hear as well. Sometimes there's, of course, the real estate agent. A good real estate agent is representing the seller's best interest, so they might be sugarcoating a few things as well. So it's always important to take what you hear with a grain of salt, but apply your own thinking and some other opinions to it before you make a decision.
Yeah. When you're negotiating on a property, what's kind of the music to your ears when it comes to the vendor's motivation? So what is something that a sales agent could say and you're like, oh, yes?
Well, to be honest, anything outside of price. So
Right.
if you ask and the agent says, "Oh, look, they're just they're selling because they're just looking for the highest price." Maybe it's an investment property. They've just cleared it out and wanting the highest price. You go, okay, great. Well, we're in the same kettle of fish as everyone else, and there's not too much we can do to pull the strings here. But anything else could be a range of wild, wonderful things that come out of their mouth. It could be one that stands out is an elderly owner had lived in a property for a very long time. She was transitioning out of that property into retirement care, and she was really, really concerned once again with that transition period. So every other buyer assumed that they only wanted the highest price. We added an extended settlement period in our offer, and it was actually accepted well. It wasn't actually the highest offer. It was
right.
a best and final situation. So that's one. Another one would be leasebacks, for instance, short settlement timeframes. Commitment elsewhere can also be a pretty favourable thing to hear.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It doesn't always have to be about price, but if you get a sniff that it's not just about price, there is something that has some negotiation room between you and the seller, then that's where I suppose you are probably more adept at pivoting or putting together these terms compared to sort of the average market that might not understand how valuable that can be.
Absolutely. It can definitely give you the edge on two offers, same price, one offer being accepted over the other, and adding to that, right?
Yep.
Two offers, one being actually a bit higher, but having poorer terms in the seller's eyes. We've seen it time and time again where the seller actually goes for the lower offer.
Now, getting to agents' motivations, this is a tricky one for me because I suppose I like to think about everything in a vacuum, and the agent has a fiduciary responsibility to provide the best outcome for the owner, but agents are human. And I heard a story the other day about an agent that had 4 auctions scheduled for a particular Saturday, and a buyer's agent got wind of that, and they said, let's try and wrap this up, before we get to that weekend. And basically their motivation was to not be as flat out on that particular day. So that kind of influenced the outcome for the owner. Now, to me, that kind of sounds horrifying as someone that might sell a property. But do you see things like that happen? And is that a real occurrence that happens regularly?
I would actually say that it's not a regular occurrence, and that probably speaks to the broader industry, in that the majority of real estate agents, hand on heart, do hold their sellers' interest in their heart, or best interests at heart. But there are usually circumstances that typically seem to be time based. So it might be a product of being in the right place at the right time. That's a great example. The real estate agent had some challenges that they needed to work through. Another example would be where a selling agent, so real estate agents typically have a contract with the seller that has an exclusive term. It's a period of time that the real estate agent can sell that property for. Now, if that term expires, then the owner of that property can either take the property off the market, exit that contract, or decide to list their property with another real estate agent. So from the real estate agent's perspective, if they're getting close to the end of that time frame, they might be staring down the barrel of having done all of this work for a seller, not having achieved a sale, and essentially having worked for free. So that can be one motivation where, and we've heard it a few times, where real estate agent says, look, I need to convince the seller to stay with me because our agreement is about to expire. So if you can help me keep the seller kind of committed to the deal, or committed to the conversation, then that's actually going to be a strong incentive for me as an agent to keep this thing alive.
And so agents would disclose that to you directly?
Sometimes they don't disclose it. Other times you can figure it out based on how long the property's been on the market for as well.
Yeah. So are there typical engagement terms? Is it typically 60 days or 90 days where they would have this agency agreement for?
It's actually a very big negotiation point for some real estate agents. Sometimes an agent might list a property with a vendor off market, and the vendor has said, look, I'll give you 7 days to bring buyers through the property, and if you can bring me on an offer, we'll entertain it. Standard agency agreements could be 90 days, some could be 6 months, but yeah, it really, really depends. So there's not cut and dry.
Mm. And I suppose if we get back to the incentive of the agent is to put a deal together, and if they're getting paid 1.9% or 2.5% or whatever it is, an increase in offer of $10,000, what comes back in their pocket is very, very marginal, right? So the main motivator is the sale. So is there anything outside of the expiry of that agreement that kind of speaks to that motivation?
Some real estate agents might list a property that's a low value compared to the rest of the properties that they typically sell.
Yep.
So naturally, real estate agents generally do take the same process for every sale. But if they're going to be earning less on a property because of its value compared to what they typically sell at, that could be a motivation. It's worth less of my time and focus. Could be one. Another one could be a volume agent, which is kind of feeding into that, but it's an agent who's very, very successful in their area, is listing a lot of properties. So again, they just naturally have less time to dedicate to each client. The good agents, of course, have really great teams around them, so that sometimes can be negated. But those would be two other things just to think of. Yeah.
Okay. So to put it all, put a nice little neat bow around the whole thing. Once we know the buyer activity, the motivations of the vendor, and the motivations of the sales agent, how do we take that information to formulate a strategy that we think is going to make us the winning party?
Aha, you're asking for the secret sauce.
Please, yes.
Mate, it then really comes down to your the way you synthesize all of that information. We could go through this whole exercise and realize that the seller's motivation is price. So then the biggest thing that I would be leaning on with my clients is that fair market value assessment, the rational opinion on what the property's worth, and leaning into the real estate agent's feedback on other buyer activity. Again, in that particular situation, highest motivation is price, but there's no other buyers interested. That would suggest that I'd start my offers lower. If I had a vendor's motivation that was a quick sale, and there was 2 other purchasers that had made offers or interested, then I would prioritize a quick process of making an offer and making the process between having an offer accepted and exchanging contracts as frictionless as possible. Yep. So that means on my part, I'm getting all of my ducks in a row. I'm not causing headaches for the agent or the seller through that process. It really comes down to the finer details of it.
Yeah. So I guess the actual strategy itself depends on the interplay between all of those different components. But I guess the main message of this podcast is you've got to understand those before you can formulate any worthwhile strategy, right? Once you know those 3 things, then you can create that strategy and it puts you in the best place to secure the property.
Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with paying a fair price for a good property if you love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matt, we've certainly learned a lot, some insightful, some quite horrifying, to be honest, but you're always very open and genuine with your insights and your advice. So thank you very much for joining us back on the show.
Not a problem, Mike. Anytime.
Cheers.